Coming up on this episode of the Mario Rosenstock podcast.
The 1930s fascists, Hitler, Mussolini, you look at them, they don't laugh. And it was one of the sort of consolations that humanity had, right? Which was, and you find this in the diaries of people being persecuted under the Nazis, where they say, well, the one thing we still have that they don't have is we have jokes, we laugh. Fascism doesn't do humor. And I think Trump is fascism plus humor. His followers also find him very, very entertaining. They find the mad shit about sharks and Hannibal Lecter and, all this kind of stuff that he riffs off. They find that like stand-up comedy. And this is new.
Well, I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and we've only gone and done it again. The last time Fintan O'Toole, esteemed Irish Times columnist and author, and I recorded a conversation for this podcast. It lasted around 2 hours and we ended up releasing it in 2 parts. And when we caught up again this week for another chat, the exact same thing happened, and I was delighted that Fintan spent the time and was able to spend the time talking to me about all these things. Because Fintan is just one of those great thinkers, in my opinion. He thinks deeply about the big things and writes brilliantly and eloquently every Tuesday now in the Irish Times. His writing is kind of a certain style, and it's very conducive to me writing my sketches. So I just turn his sketches, his columns upside down sometimes, and I create comic sketches from them, which is a great compliment to him, I believe. In this conversation, Fintan looks at things like immigration, religion, and what it means to be Irish from a very unique perspective, and talks about what he sees in such an eloquent way. So when we get stuck into a great conversation, I let it run for as long as he'll allow me, and I think you'll see why.
The other thing we have going for us is that they're idiots. Like the far right in Ireland currently is made up of idiots. If they got their act together, if there was a coherent plan, if there was a charismatic leader, who wasn't Conor McGregor, yeah. We really can't afford to be complacent about this. Private rental had pretty much disappeared in Ireland. And the state, after the crash, engineered a situation in which we went back to landlordism. That, which if you think about Irish history and you think about the struggle against the landlord and all that stuff, right? Going back to this, right? America destroyed its own industrial base. I mean, Trump has a point about this, right? It is extraordinary the way they dismantled their industrial base and shipped it off to China, And there's a real ground for the resentment felt by Americans who've been kind of left behind in those rust belts. But that problem is not going to be solved by making the country stupid again.
Part 1 of my chat with the great Fintan O'Toole coming up right after this. There's a job available, a job vacancy, now that Elon Musk has fallen out so terribly with Donald Trump. Breaking up is hard to do, as Neil Sedaka famously said. Listen, there's a spot free, there's a vacancy free in that place in America, D.O.G.E, the Department of Government Efficiency. And we have had access to the files, of course, from America, which allows us to see who's applying and who's not applying for the job. Listen to this.
This is President Donald J. Trump. If you would like to meet me in person for the knockdown price, and I mean it's a knockdown price of $5 million, please press 1. If you would like to invest in my fantastic, unbelievable meme coin, please press 2. If you would like to buy some merch, incredible merch, Donald J. Trump merch, all made in China, the merch, amazing merch, please press 3. And if you would like to apply for the new head of D.O.G.E, D.O.G.E, we all know D.O.G.E, we love D.O.G.E. Elon has left D.O.G.E because Elon has left me. We love Elon, nasty guy, but beautiful guy. D.O.G.E position is free. Leave a message.
Yes, hello, President Trump. This is Pascal Donoghue applying for your position in D.O.G.E. I have a fantastic track record with overseeing finances. You will see from my email and my curriculum vitae, the National Children's Hospital we secured for a mere $900 million. It has had slight overruns and a snag list. We are currently at $2.2 billion, but I hope that demonstrates my frugality in that regard. I have also completed the $300 million initial installment on a rail project called Metro North, which we hope we can, no shovels on that yet, but we hope we can get over the line for approximately $22.2 billion. Now, we've given the green light to a bike shed here a few months ago in Ireland, which came in at an amazing price of €350,000 which most people believe is a bargain for a bike shed. Thanking you. Goodbye. Yeah, this is Michael O'Leary here. I think I'm unmatched as one billionaire to another in reducing people's costs. My proposals are as such. I will make all American government workers pay for the seat that they occupy every morning. We can decide on the details later, but anyway, they will have to buy their own uniforms for $400 each. The canteen will be stocked with chicken paninis costing €30. That's $42.50 a pop. Allocation of one vodka baggie per each employee at the Christmas party, which they will have to buy tickets to according to a dynamic priced lottery system. But there will be sale, a kind of a pre-coin sale of these Xmas party tickets in the previous February. Anyway, thank you. Shut up. Anyway, buddy, Keith Duffy here. As one hugely innovative titan of the motor industry leaves the D.O.G.E role, it's only fitting that another takes his place, i.e. me. Hey, buddy. I have overseen or built a peerless Thailand business into a profitable, almost profitable business. I've also overseen difficult, necessary efficiencies. I now no longer pay for my team to go to Turkey to get their teeth done. It is now a backstreet clinic in Azerbaijan. The tetanus shots add a bit of cost, but it's still a bit cheaper than Kusadasi, buddy. Get back to me, buddy.
And I would love to see Keith Duffy personally get that job in D.O.G.E in the United States. But of course, thanks to my great sponsor, Deluxe Bathrooms, for making this whole thing possible. Deluxe Bathrooms are Ireland's premium bathroom and tile retailer. If you're dreaming of a bathroom that combines luxury, functionality and style, they've got you covered, and at great prices too. So get yourself down to the nearest Deluxe Bathroom store. You'll find them at Dundalk Retail Park and Little Island in Cork, or online at deluxebathrooms.ie. They've been great supporters of this podcast, and it's great to see them get involved in the audio world itself. Generally, you can save up to 70% store-wide on Europe's biggest brands of bathware, furniture, tiles down at Deluxe Bathrooms. Get online, deluxebathrooms.ie, and find that bathroom that you've been dreaming about for so long. So it's time to meet my special guest on this episode, Fintan O'Toole. On the day that we talked, we caught up as he was just back from a trip to the States. So we kicked off the chat right there.
Strangely, I was doing a trip which myself and my siblings had planned last year without thinking that Donald Trump was going to be back in power.
Yeah.
So it was a walking trip around Nevada and Utah and Arizona.
We asked for your passports.
Jesus, we were going over. Yes, absolutely.
No, I'm wondering, did ICE pick you up in Nevada and Utah?
Well, I was a bit worried, to be honest, about getting in and all that, but everything was fine.
Exactly, because as a journalist, there is this whole thing, even in pre-clearance in Dublin Airport, they have a look at you as a journalist, and, they would have been, they may or may not have seen some of your writings or been aware of it or not, and then you would have wondered.
I was genuinely pretty nervous this time because I know people, journalists, academics, scientists, and it's not necessarily that they won't let you in, but they want to strip your phone or your laptop of whatever might be on it, and of course, yourself from this business, you have things on your phone, and your laptop that are private, not just private to you, but they're also kind of, they might include things that, data or information or contacts that you've said you're going to keep confidential. So there's all that kind of stuff, all that kind of concern. So it's a terrible thought, isn't it, Mario? A lot of us have very complicated feelings about the United States, but I don't think we ever thought you were going to see a situation where people were going to be afraid to go into the United States on ideological grounds, other than the sort of extreme thing you had to sign, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party or whatever? But,
do you deal drugs?
General,
yeah.
Are you a terrorist?
Yeah.
That's what it's But that having expressed opinions about, for example, Gaza, is now something that young people particularly have to be genuinely concerned about.
Let me come to you about that in a minute. Save that for a little while, because I just wanted to ask you just a little bit about yourself. Because I suppose you officially retired from the Irish Times, isn't that right?
Yeah, officially, yeah.
I want to dig in
year.
deeper into that, right? So, but you're still in the Irish Times.
Well, I still write a column every week, which I intend to do. Well, I tend to die with my boots on in terms of writing columns. It's something I've done for most of my life now, and I'll probably continue doing it as long as anybody's willing to publish it. So I have a very good relationship with the Irish Times. They've been very good to me over the years, and for whatever reasons, they were anxious for me to keep the column going. So I'm very happy.
That's
but I'm not on the staff anymore. I'm not
that's what I associate you doing with the Irish Times, reading your column on Tuesdays. So what else were you doing for the Irish Times? Were you taking the bins out?
I was, yeah. I worked in the kitchen. So,
Giving consumer advice to Conor Pope when he was running out of things.
Yeah. Well, I used to write 2 columns a week. I used to one on Saturday, one on Tuesday, which might not sound like an awful lot, but actually 2 columns a week is not too many people do 2 columns a week because it's sort of having 2 different ideas every week is a bit different. I was literary editor for quite a period. I speak to a writer, so I used to do a lot of different journalistic jobs. The things that people would see, the front of house stuff would have been the columns, certainly. But I'm glad to be only kind of writing the one now. It's sort of, I think, is a bit easier to do, and hopefully you can keep the quality up even as the mind declines.
I don't think the mind is declining at all. I'm rereading this, and I'm rereading your tome in preparation for our interview today. So
that's quite a lot of homework to have to do.
I read it once, all 570 pages of it, and then I was flicking through it again. And first of all, I'm insanely proud of myself for being able to finish any book these days, considering my attention span has been snapped to 0. But I was telling people online and everything how much I enjoyed this book and how brilliant it was. And for those people who don't know, it's a book called We Don't Know Ourselves, and it encompasses, I suppose, a picture. It captures Irish history, or at least Fintan's understanding of Irish history from his birth till the present day. And it sort of reflects Irish history from the point of view of him having passed through and seen it, his own personal experience. So, for example, he's born in Crumlin, and of course that's one of the first great social housing escapades in Ireland, adventures in Ireland, and of course then you can get onto it talking about housing. But I have to say, the more and more, when I re-looked at the book, the more I thought it was more like Forrest Gump than a book, really, right? And Fintan Gump is our hero because he seems to pop up incredulously almost in every amazing area of Irish history, very much like Tom Hanks in that film. So, for example, Fintan becomes an altar boy. And one day, anyway, who comes to the church but Archbishop John Charles McQuaid? Dun, dun, dun. Yeah, then Fintan gets a job, because we all need a job when we're 14 and our parents hunt us out to get a job, in a nascent a supermarket called Dunn Stores, in which he's put to work with a young fella called Ben Dunn. Dun, dun, dun. Then Fintan is walking along the road once in, I don't know, could have been Galway or something, and a Lancia, a big sports car, pulls over and picks him up. It's a priest. It's Archbishop Casey. Dun, 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 dun. And on and on and on it goes. And of course, all those experiences are true, Fintan. But even your dad met Muhammad Ali on the Enniskerry Road because he was a bus driver. When Muhammad Ali, I was talking to Dave Hannigan about that a few weeks ago because Dave wrote a book about
great book, actually.
Beautiful book. Yeah. The big fight about when Ali came to Ireland. And I said to him that I'd read that in your book. But one of the things, anyway, that comes out of your book, the history of Ireland kind of, is, I don't know if you can comment on this, but this kind of, one of the themes running through your book is what you might call Irish people's propensity for doubleness. This double way of looking at things. Explain to our listeners, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, I called the book "We Don't Know Ourselves" precisely because I thought it itself has a double meaning, right? So although I discovered this doesn't work at all outside Ireland, right?
Yeah, in Ireland we say you won't know yourself.
You say, "Oh, we got a new lawnmower." We don't know ourselves with the new lawnmower, right? It's like, and everybody else anywhere around the world doesn't get this. But I thought it had both that double meaning, which was, look, if you take it as a whole, going back to 1958 when I was born, and you look at where we were then and where we are now, well, we got the new lawnmower. I mean, I'm not nostalgic. It's an immensely better place than it was for most people. We can have opportunities of a certain dignity, have a chance to live their life. Of course, I'm a critic of so many things that are present in Ireland, but that overall reality, is really striking when you look at it in that perspective. But the other side of it is we don't know ourselves. We actually not knowing, and it's this a capacity to know and not know, to not know what's in front of us. Two examples of this, kind of random ones that come to mind. But one is if you take things like the industrial schools and the Magdalen laundries. Irish people were genuinely shocked when all this stuff started coming out in the 1990s and the 2000s, and yet all these institutions were like there, they were right in our faces. The last Magdalen laundry, as you know, was 10 minutes walk from the GPO in Dublin, in Sean McDermott Street, closed in 1996, In Galway, like the Magdalen laundry was right in the middle of the town, Cork, Waterford, New Ross, the industrial schools were, I remember, I don't know, you're younger than me, but there were two words I do not remember not knowing, right? As a child growing up in Crumlin. One was letterfrack, and the other was dangan. Mm-hmm. I think I knew these words when I was 3 or 4, because they were the things you were threatened with as a child. If you don't behave yourself, you'll end up in letterfrack, And so the terror of these places, the idea that these horrific institutions were part of our life was just there. And yet we managed not to know it. I'm not saying people were hypocritical when they were shocked by when they kind of discovered all this in the 1990s. It was because we'd sort of had this thing of both knowing and not knowing. The other great example of it is Charlie Haughey, who was a genius. He's the most brilliant example of corruption, political corruption in a democracy that I can think of. Because most people who were corrupt, leaders who were corrupt, hid it, they pretended that they were just sort of ordinary Joe Soaps living an ordinary life on their ordinary politician's salary. Haughey had ostensibly only a politician's salary from the late 1950s onwards, and he had the island, the yacht, the helicopter, the stud farm, the nicest Georgian mansion in County Dublin, the Charvet shirts, the whole, So again, it was a kind of brilliant understanding of the psychology of Ireland, right? Which was that if I make this so much in your face, this mechanism will kick in somehow that we'll kind of see it and not see it, and he was brilliant. He got away with it. Yes, he was found out in the end, but he died happy. He died with an awful lot of money, those two things are just examples of this stuff where we had this sort of capacity to work our way around reality rather than confront it.
And in doing so, delude ourselves that it was happening, even though a part of our conscious mind knew it was happening. One example, my favorite example, and I told you before when you first appeared on my podcast, I told you before that I'd often used your articles as a vehicle towards a comic sketch. And I would take the serious depth of what you were talking about, kind of turn it upside down and just turn it into farce by almost presenting it just with character voices to depict what I'm talking about. But one of the ones which, if I was doing another sketch now, would have just presented itself as so obvious, was your treatment of the Ansbacher accounts. And the Ansbacher accounts, for people who don't know, were people who were housing offshore monies. And the only way you could house offshore monies was to prove that you were not a resident of Ireland. And literally, the AIB or Bank of Ireland or any of the banks, you could go into this thing and you could say, I'm an offshore resident. And so Jimmy, I won't say a surname because we don't want any legal things, but Jimmy, let's say the farmer from Letterfrack, would go into his local bank and he'd say, I'm an offshore resident. And Johnny, the bank manager, would go, that's great, Jimmy. Park your money in there. See, how's the farm? It's great.
Yeah.
And literally,
how's the missus?
How's the missus?
How's the kids? I believe her daughter's doing the leaving cert, isn't she? Yeah. But I'm not here. No, I'm not here. No.
And so you're not living, now you're not here. You're not in the country. No, I'm not in the country. It's absolutely, frankly, bizarre. And again, you couldn't have, Hall's Pictorial Weekly couldn't have done it back in the day.
Like you're absolutely right, Maro. You know, like this is, I suppose, one of the saving graces of a book like this is that although some of the stuff is grim, it is also funny. You know, I mean, just at a certain level, like you know, there is a sort of mad humor to the thing, but that's exactly true. So you had two versions of this that was going on. So again, older people will remember just how fucking awful the 1980s was in Ireland. You know, it was dreadful. You know, every young person who could get out of the place was getting out. You know, the most interesting place in Ireland was the queue at the American embassy every morning, you know, to get the green cards and the Donnelly visas and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, you had mass unemployment, you had a real sense of despair. And then there was there was no money in the country, right? Which was a big lie. It was all, you know, it was just a lie. And you had these two kind of schemes that were running. One was this sort of evasion of dirt tax, which was a very small tax on big bank deposits, right? And that was the one where, you know, that's been run in pretty much every bank in every town in Ireland, right? You walked in and you had this kind of ritual, you know, where you signed a thing saying that you weren't a resident and therefore you didn't pay the tax. And then the big version of this, as you mentioned, was the Ansbacher one. And this was being run by Charlie Haughey, by all his cronies, all that circle. That was a sort of gold-plated version of it, where their money was ostensibly in the Cayman Islands, even though it actually wasn't, right? Mm-hmm. And so this again was to avoid tax, you know. So what they would do is, you know, it was sort of complicated, but not that complicated. What they would do is they would lodge the money in Guinness Mahon Bank in Dublin,
loan it to themselves,
and then the genius of this, and this is again where, you know, if you were making it up as a comic sketch, people say, come on, you know, that can't be really true, is it? So not only did they then not pay tax, but they got tax relief on it because it was a loan, yes, right? On which they were ostensibly paying interest. You know, the brazenness of it, the sort of just the sheer in your face, you know, F you, you know, we'll do what we like.
And your book is, and your book is full of that sort of irony stroke hypocrisy stroke bizarreness. Even to the extent that, like, I remember another piece of the book which is so interesting, and it's dealing with the way we dealt with Bishop Casey, and to the point that everybody knew what happened. Everybody knew what happened. He had admitted what happened. It was plain as day. Yet the National Theatre, that was the Late Late Show, had to have a show in which a whole load of his friends were brought in, like a kangaroo court, onto the Late Late Show with Gay Byrne, and they questioned Annie Murphy as to whether any of this happened in the first place.
Absolutely.
Completely and utterly bizarre. And Gay Byrne, almost as the kind of malevolent, almost prosecutor-in-chief, kind of putting her up to question, you know, that this, you know, and a bizarre. So in other words, we were supposed to believe that this happened, but yet maybe for this kind of kabuki theatre believed that it didn't happen.
Kabuki theatre is a very, very, very good analogy. It's absolutely right, though, you know, because she was put on trial, basically. You know, the Late Late Show, which in many ways was a brilliant and incredibly important forum for the country, and Byrne was a genius broadcaster, you know, brilliant man, but he had these very deeply conservative prejudices, you know, and he loved Casey, he loved the church, he loved Charlie Haughey, he loved all that, and you know, it was kind of, it showed he was losing his touch a bit because he went way too far with this, right? So yeah, they basically set up people in the audience who were like friends and relatives of Casey to say, well, in your book, you say that you had sex by moonlight with Casey in the car.
We have a calendar here that shows the moon wasn't actually out that night.
Their clouds would have, you know, whatever. It couldn't have been. I mean, just, you know, just kind of mad stuff, you know. But the great moment of that was she was an American, you know. She wasn't playing these games. She wasn't doing this sort of, sliding around and I'm really ashamed of myself and I'm really sorry and I got carried away and she was just doing, this is what happened, and I'm really proud of who I am. I'm proud of my son. I'm telling you the truth. And there was that extraordinary moment at the end of it where Byrne said to her in this really patronizing way, well, if your son is half the man his father was, he won't be so bad. And she just turned and she stood. She said, well, I'm not so bad myself, Mr. Byrne, and walked off the stage. Yeah. And it was just a moment when whole Ireland was just sort of, we're not doing this anymore.
Yes.
Like everybody knew that she was absolutely right, that he was sexist, he was chauvinistic, he was patronizing.
And I'm not going to be the humiliated woman in your dark play,
And she wasn't going to do it.
And so I'm not so bad myself, Mr. Byrne. And that's actually how you end the book. You end the book by going, after all that's said and done, after 1958 and all this, and after, through your lifetime, what's happened to Ireland and everything. Bad points, good points. There's a ledger, there's a balance sheet, but I suppose we're not so bad ourselves, and that's possibly that's one way of putting it. So what I wanted to ask you was what your opinions on this, and that is looking around the world now. You had an election in Poland there yesterday, and the far right candidate was kind of getting in, and there's trouble in the Netherlands, and there's more far rights shifting all over Europe, and then there's Trump and all that sort of stuff. And in a way, there's a reform movement in Great Britain, and Nigel Farage is kind of waiting in the wings, and he's another little Trumpy sort of character. And in a way, Ireland, as well as being a geographical outlier on the edge of Europe, is almost a kind of at the moment, a slightly political outlier, in the sense that we seem to have eschewed all this or ignored it or kind of bypassed it a bit. And we seem to be more, I suppose, for want of a better expression, politically stable than some of these countries. What do you think of that? Do you think that's a good thing? Do you think that we are still... Do you think that political stability is even the wrong word for it? Do you think we're mired in sclerosis and a certain form of corruption, or do you think we are a stable place and that is part of the not so bad ourselves?
I think first of all we can't afford to be complacent about any of this stuff. We're not better than anybody else innately. And there's undoubtedly there's a huge structural problem in the South, right, which is obvious to everybody, right, which is we have this booming economy, ostensibly. We have all these kind of great figures. And yet, and it's an astonishing thing, which is that conservative governments, we've never had anything else except conservative governments, have engineered a system which kills the engine of conservatism, right? So what makes people conservative is you get married, you get a house, or you get married, you get a partner, you get a house. Getting the house, getting the mortgage is
the social contract.
Is the big social contract, right? And it's astonishing to me. I still can't quite explain how conservative parties who've sort of built everything on this, right, have turned off that tap, have made it impossible for younger people to actually, get a house, and have trapped them in some of the most expensive rental property in Europe. And it's a very dangerous situation because it's, as well as being just miserable for so many people, it's also profoundly undemocratic. There's a question I keep asking is, when did we ever have an election in which any major party said, by the way, we're going to stop you getting mortgages. By the way, we're going to, socially re-engineer our society into a rental society, right? There's an amazing thing, Mario, which is that actually, for all the terrible things about Ireland, private rental had pretty much disappeared in Ireland on any kind of long-term basis by the 1990s, right? So overwhelmingly, Irish people either lived in houses that they were buying, that they had a mortgage for, or they lived in social housing, right? And so the private rental market was very, very small. I mean, genuinely very small, and it was shrinking. And certainly you didn't live in it long term, right? It was students who lived in it for a couple of years, or, you know, people who were between jobs or whatever. But people didn't have to make their lives in a private rental market. And the state, after the great crash of 2008, engineered a situation in which we went back to landlordism. That, you know, which if you think about Irish history and you think about the struggle against the landlord and all that stuff, right? Going back to this, right? But okay, you could say, well, maybe there was a case to be made for this, but nobody ever made the case. Nobody ever went to an Irish electorate and said, by the way, this is what we think is a really good idea, and this is the policy we're going to pursue. So it's very dangerous when you've done a huge piece of social engineering for which you have never sought social consent, right? So the underlying situation here is something we need, not to be complacent about, right? There's certainly enough reason for deep discontent. But I would say there's three things maybe that have held it at bay and have made us different. One is we've done all the mad shit, right? We've had crazy nationalism, you know, at its most extreme, right? We've had people going into cafes and pubs and blowing people up, you know, for the nation, right? We've had a sort of inoculation, at least about some of that stuff, right? Some of it's creeping back in, I think, in some ways. But you know, we went through what ethno-nationalism looks like in a kind of exclusivist, extremist way. And I think most people had a look at it and decided, actually, you know, it's not a great way to be. And we've also seen a kind of version of it playing out in Britain with Brexit. I know we've had another kind of reminder of actually, you know, don't go there. You know, it's just pretty stupid. The second thing, of course, is that we have our own strange identity. You know, we're not like anybody else in that there is no other country in the world whose population is still lower than it was in 1840. Right? There's no other country in the world like that. Why is that? Because we were depopulated by mass emigration. So our history, our identity, our sense of ourselves, right, is actually very complicated. There's not a single Irish person who doesn't have cousins and aunts and uncles, or who maybe themselves hasn't been a migrant. You know, we sort of know what it's like. And at least the older people in Ireland, like people of my generation, remember what it's like to be not just the cool, desirable emigrants, you know, but the dirty, unwanted terrorist, the labourer, the person who is stereotyped and hated and you know, treated as alien. There's surely some memory there of that, and maybe it gives us some kind of inoculation. And to be positive about this for a second, you know, of course there's racism, of course there's xenophobia, there's all those sort of things. But look at what ordinary Irish people have done over the last 30 years. We've gone from having a society in which there was virtually no immigration we're talking about, to having 20% of people living in Ireland now were born somewhere else. And by and large, you know, and I'm not at all diminishing the problems that lots of people have had. I'm not, particularly black people have had, you know, often have experienced and still experience real racism. But by and large, the society has dealt with this extraordinarily well. The schools have been brilliant. The GoLoud has been brilliant. The local communities have been brilliant, you know. And it's often the poorest people, it's often the people in the most marginalised communities who dealt with this first, you know, with very little help, with very little sympathy, with very little support. My wife taught for years and years in an inner city school in Dublin, you know. And I mean, they went from, a lot of these kids like hadn't been on the south side, you know, like, you know, I mean, you know, very, very insular communities, you know, and within a couple of years, there was suddenly like 40-50% of the kids in the class didn't speak English, you know. And yes, of course, there was trouble and there was problems and there was, you know, terrible things said. But mostly they got on with it, you know, they welcomed people, they made friends, they, you know, and I think they don't get enough credit for this. Like we see the rioters, we see the, you know, the mouths, we see the people who are out trying to make hay out of you know, stirring up hatred about these things. But we don't see the fact that actually most people have dealt with this really, really well. And I think a lot of this has to do with memory. And the third thing we have is, of course, that you know, all of this has been happening in a context of economic growth, right? So where this stuff is really difficult, of course, is when you have inward migration, and then you have, a slump. Like in Britain, I mean, Britain is stuck in this kind of stagnant economy, and that's the same in a lot of European countries. So it's a lot more difficult for people to see, look, this immigration is happening because we're a better place than we used to be. Nobody in their right mind wanted to come and, look for a job, look for a better life in Ireland, in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, certainly not in the 1980s, that actually, there is some understanding, I think, that this is part of being a successful nation. Mm-hmm. So I think we have some inoculation against this, but and then the other thing we have going for us is that they're idiots. Like the far right in Ireland currently is made up of idiots. If they got their act together, if there was a coherent plan, if there was a charismatic leader, who wasn't Conor McGregor, it's still there. We really can't afford to be complacent about this. But we're lucky at the moment, I think, is that that. The far right is like the old far left. The first item on the agenda seems to be the split, and they argue over who has the gold bars, and so there's not a very significant, coherent political program there.
Yeah, I mean, if they could get their act together, I mean, it's an easy target because people like to other people when they want a problem. They want to find. Yeah. They want to find the culprit. I mean, no better time to get onto victimhood and self-pity than we should go to America now. So you arrived back from America. You were in Nevada and Utah, and as you said, you felt a bit nervous going over. And do you have any feelings from your visit over there? Appertaining to what we're talking about, the whole Trump experience and everything. I mean, I want to talk to you about two things really. Your relationship with, for example, education, third level education, and this sort of really, really bizarre attack on Harvard, third level institutions, foreign students in third level institutions that Trump is sort of initiating. These foreign students, which turn out to be the best and the biggest, the CEOs of their greatest companies, the makers of research and development that power America forward. These are the people that do it. These are the best and brightest in the world coming to America, and he wants to get them out. This is a grudge, maybe personal. Maybe he did apply to Harvard. Maybe he did get refused. Maybe so did Eric. Maybe so did Donald. Maybe so did half his family. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility. Nobody holds a personal grudge more deeply than him. This, from a person who worked in a university yourself and who has deep ties to the writing in university and everything and doing journals and all this, and of course from your studies and your books and, you learned people that you've read, and poetry as well, your big interest in poetry and Heaney and all that sort of stuff. This must be more shocking to you than it is for your regular dude in Ireland or anywhere really. This must be hitting you kind of hard, and it must be a real mad one that even maybe you didn't even see coming.
Oh, I really didn't, Mario, because maybe naively, you always assume there has to be some level of logic, So we know what Trump is like. We know what the people around him are like. We know the chaos. We know the sort of self-indulgence, the egotism, the monomania, all those things. But you still think there has to be some level of logic here, right? Which is, make America great again. Well, okay. You might start with looking, well, what do you have that's great? Hell of a lot wrong with America, hell of a lot of injustice, a hell of a lot of, grotesque inequalities. But one of the things they have, as you've said, right, you've very eloquently put this, but, I taught in the Ivy League university there for 12 years, and you see this, you see it on a daily level. You can almost feel jealous about, which is these institutions attract, incredibly smart people from all over the world as students, as teachers. they spin off, like very quickly, actually, they spin off this talent into, every area of life, science, business, the arts. It's a huge powerhouse of economic growth, of innovation. It's what makes America what it is. America destroyed its own industrial base. I mean, Trump has a point about this, right? It is extraordinary the way they dismantled their industrial base and shipped it off to China, And there's a real kind of ground for the resentment felt by Americans who've been kind of left behind in those rust belts. But they're not going to be, that problem is not going to be solved, right, by making the country stupid again, by stripping out its intellectual capital. I mean, Ireland is a great example of this, right? We didn't get to be where we are by anything else really except education. I mean, if there was one word you wanted to say, like, why is Ireland now so vastly better than it was in 1958? It's education. And anybody with a stem of wit, right, understands that educational capital, is the driver of almost everything else that's going to happen to you, that's going to be good in the contemporary 21st century world. So there's this attack on the universities, which is really to do, I don't like using the F word, but it is fascistic, right? It is to do with the fact that these are places we don't control. So we want to control them, right? But it's also, it goes beyond that. I think a lot of this is driven by climate change. I think a lot of it's driven by, if you want to say climate change is a hoax, you then have to say science is a hoax, right? Because climate change is, unfortunately, the most dramatic example we have of how science works, right? Which is that actually scientists were right, and they've been right for 30, 40, 50 years about all this stuff. And we're seeing the consequences now. So if you want to say that's all a hoax, that's all nonsense, not happening, you then have to really, you're kind of driven to say science itself is crap. It's just made up. And these scientists are just liars. And so it's not just the attack on the universities, but, they're firing, I mean, Musk goes in and fires scientists, in the Centers for Disease Control, in the National Institutes of Health, Now, I mean, again, like, no-brainer stuff, like, but where is a huge amount of wealth being created? It's being created in medicine. We're on the brink of an extraordinary era in healthcare, in medicine, in new drugs, the technologies which are really beginning to come up, which is this kind of combination of AI and biotechnology, are extraordinary. I mean, I don't pretend to understand all of them, but you get some sense of, once they developed messenger RNA, for example, and you think, they can actually engineer the body to send a message to certain cells, to stop doing what they're doing or do something else. I mean, it's extraordinary stuff and it's fantastic. And it's going to be one of the great leaps forward in human history, and it's going to produce incredible wealth. I mean, just look at it from the point of view of economics, right? I mean, why does Novo Nordisk now have a bigger turnover than the entire Danish GDP otherwise, because it produces Ozempic, whatever you think about these things, right? This is where wealth is, right? And so the Trump administration is carpet bombing all the stuff that kind of is producing the pipeline.
Yes,
for the future.
It is. I'll just tag on to what you're saying there, Fintan. It's carpet bombing it. It's destroying it, because the big fear of power is independent, intellectual, and potentially, therefore, dissident thought. You must eliminate the dissidents. You must eliminate the Solzhenitsyns. You must eliminate the people who write the Gulag Archipelago. You must eliminate the people who can write stuff that people understand that is true, that is naturally, beautifully true. You must eliminate truth. And this all goes back to, I mean, just to riff with you for a moment, this all goes back to that moment, that day on Fox, when Kellyanne Conway said, we have our own alternative facts. That was the genesis of all this, when they said, facts are not facts. They're not objective facts. They're now subjective facts. And then not only the subjective facts then morph from being objective facts to subjective facts to being our facts. It's our facts now. And then there are no facts It's only what we say at any point in time. And then it's not we, it's only what he says, Trump, at any point in time. And that is the true culticization, if you like to mangle a word, of the country, when a country becomes enchanted to a cult. And that's gone. That means facts are gone, truth is gone, objective thing is gone. And so you don't need, J.D. Vance is anti-intellectual. He wants to attack the universities. And it's all coming from Project 2025. Yeah. And this guy, Vout, V-O-U-G-H-T, this guy is a real guy. He's been working at this a long, long time. And he's been, getting in this document. He's been working on this for years through the Heritage Foundation. And it's basically been put through bit by bit and point by point. And I see it as an extension of the fascist thing. And I can't think there's much other way of looking at it.
I completely agree with you. I think we've all been reluctant for very good historical reasons not to use the F word so much. Don't throw it around. But you can actually also use it too little. But like when it's staring you in the face, you have to call it what it is. And of course, it's not the same as the 1930s because we're not living in the 1930s, right? The media world, the technology world, the political world, they're all very different. But the core, which is this thing of personal control, that you have a dictator. Your analogy with cults, I think, is very well made, because the cult really works when you get people to agree to the absurd.
Correct.
Right. It's not very hard to get people to agree to something that actually, seems like it makes sense.
Correct.
It's when you're saying, well, maybe we could inject ourselves with bleach, to cure COVID, and significant numbers of people are saying, wow, that sounds like a great idea. Well, the leader said it must be true, or, the opposite of which is, that, just think about what's happened in America in recent months, right? Which is a major American city burned down. Los Angeles, huge parts of Los Angeles just burned down, and it didn't happen. It's already, I was walking around this kind of, these very hot parts of America, some of them, and you see, you're seeing the scars from last year's wildfires, and they're waiting for this year's, and if you talk to people who live in these landscapes, they're telling you it's never been like this. Like I was talking to Navajo people, for example, who, they've lived in some of these places for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They know in incredible detail, how to live there. They know about the climate. They know about the water. And, they'll tell you it's just it's on its way out. It's the possibility of living in some of these places is impossible, and yet in terms of the Trump discourse, Trump world, this is all a hoax. None of it ever happened, So you either say it was Jewish space lasers that caused the fires, or, and sometimes you don't even have to say anything. You just need not to cover it, not to talk about it, not to get it into people's heads. The bizarre thing, Mario, is, that the fastest growing parts of the United States are some of the places I was in, like in Nevada, people are moving to the desert, And I was there on Friday. I was coming back through Las Vegas. It was 107 degrees. It's unlivable. It's already unlivable. Just the amount of power, the amount of energy it takes to, keep your house cool enough, your car, your office. Everything has to be in these kind of almost bunkers, of to protect you from the climate. So, I think you're absolutely right that you need to have this kind of cult-like devotion to alternative facts.
Yeah,
and that is what fascism does.
It is, and I'm sorry. You said we're tentative about getting to the F word, and then people are tentative about using Orwell as well. And, it was been, Orwell was around, 2015 they were talking about Trump and Orwell, But, one of the things that Orwell says is, that the final thing that he asks you is not to believe what you see with your own eyes. And that is the final and most I can't remember the exact, but the most important command basically that they give you.
Yes.
Do not believe.
Yes.
Seeing is disbelieving, basically.
Yes.
Do not believe
Yes.
what you see with your own eyes. And
Yes.
I had another, Patrick will go mad with me now because I'm going to repeat myself, but I had a comedian on the podcast recently. And one of the things he had done was he had done a little bit of amateur wrestling. And he had done wrestling. And he had done performative wrestling. In other words, entertainment wrestling.
Yeah.
Yep. And he had done it in Britain. So like he was around with, he would, the giant haystacks and all that sort of stuff. He would have heard about all them and stuff. So it was like the British equivalent of the American one. And it struck me that we got talking to this aspect that Trump's entire MO is WWE. And I mean, he was very much part of the WWE. He was a performer in WWE. You can YouTube him and you can see him fight in WWE. You can see him fight Vince McMahon. But the whole WWE experience is exactly what the Trump experience is, because I asked the comedian, just as a matter of interest, I said, listen, do the audience believe it? And he said to me, no, but they choose to believe it. Right? So he says, absolutely at the bottom of their core, in their heart of hearts, of course they don't believe it. But he says they suspend all that and they go into a kind of a dreamlike reverie and they accept what's before them. They accept what's before them, and the baddies are the baddies and the goodies are the goodies. And it's not Abbey Theatre stuff. It's not going down to the gate and looking at Oscar Wilde. This is high grade, weapons grade indoctrination. They believe it then. So it's like a hypnosis.
I would fully agree with that. I'd be interested in your views about a theory I have, right? Which is, so I think all of that is absolutely true. And I think, I don't want to be too abstract about this, but Walter Benjamin, the great thinker in the 1930s under fascism, he eventually committed suicide, a Jewish guy trying to get out of Nazi Germany. But Benjamin said that the aestheticization of politics is fascism, right? So what he was saying is when politics becomes like art, that's fascism, right? And I think that's what's happening, right? Which is that it's all performance, right? So it's all suspension of disbelief. So it's no longer about I believe this. It's about I suspend my disbelief. I willingly suspend my disbelief, right? And therefore I disarm all that stuff that we need for democracy, which is skepticism, critical thinking. Asking yourself, is this really true? Is this bullshit? What's the facts behind this? I mean, all that stuff goes. But I'd be really interested in what you think about this, which is because I think, and I'm writing this in New York Review books recently, but I think about Trump and comedy, which is that what's new, right, is that the 1930s fascists performed very seriously, right? So Hitler, Mussolini, you look at them, they don't laugh, right? And it was one of the sort of the consolations that sort of humanity had, right? Which was, and you find this in the diaries of people being persecuted under the Nazis, where they say, well, the one thing we still have that they don't have is we have jokes, we laugh, Fascism doesn't do humor. And I think Trump is fascism plus humor. I think that the next phase of this is that it's sort of taken over comedy, Those of us who are horrified by Trump don't get the fact that his followers also find him very, very entertaining. They find the mad shit about sharks and Hannibal Lecter and all this kind of stuff that he riffs off. They find that like stand-up comedy as well.
Yep.
And this is new. So he has constructed this kind of strange combination of the cult, which is, the great leader and you must obey, but also in return, I will sort of entertain you. I will make you laugh. Yeah. And I will make you laugh at them. So it's not that It's not the joking of
Lion Ted Cruz. It's crooked Hillary. It's the sharing it with the masses. So I remember once he put it out to tender. Should I call her Lion Hillary or crooked Hillary? And this was very interesting because he was asking the mob,
Lion Hillary, crooked Hillary. You pick. You like lion better or crooked better?
And it was like giving it to them, sharing the bread with them at the Coliseum, you know. And that's where we're going to leave it for this episode. Fintan and I talked way, way, way more, particularly about Donald Trump. He had a lot of very interesting things. We shot some theories out at each other and got embedded in a deep conversation about America, comedy, self-pity, politics, satire, and of course Trump. And of course whether Fintan himself is really considering a run for the Irish presidency. We'll bring you that all in next week's episode. Thanks to Deluxe Bathrooms, my great sponsor, deluxebathrooms.ie or online. And thanks to you, of course, the most important element, the listener. Tell one other person about this podcast if you can. And if you can, I'll see you next week back for the second part of Fintan O'Toole's epic conversation with me. Thanks, take care.